Hello dear viewers, and welcome back to the ancient dwarven hold of our ancestors. Today I shall be discussing another topic of interest, and that is the question, were video games better when we were younger? Before we get going, dear viewers, if you enjoy what I do down here in the ancient hold, then please consider subscribing to the channel, giving it a thumbs up, and maybe leave a comment with your thoughts on whether video games were better when we were younger. I think this is an interesting topic to talk about, for it seems there are several ways to interpret the question on whether video games were better when we were younger. I'll briefly state what I think are the key angles of approach with regards to this question, before delving deep into each in turn. There is the simple view of looking at the technical prowess of games nowadays against those of back in the day, of ray tracing, anti-aliasing techniques, complicated geometry and hair physics of the modern games against the simpler graphics and lower computational ability of systems which older games were designed for. Then there is the question of scope. Are video games of the more modern era capable of creating vast landscapes full of all sorts of constructs and details while implementing complicated systems and mechanics? And what of the passion and drive behind making computer games? Have developers learned from the now decades of previous games, taking lessons from those and applying them to their own creations, standing on the shoulders of giants as it were? Or are developers and publishers now more concerned with metrics and revenue rather than having the players in mind with regards to most of the decisions being made when creating a game? And this leads on to the issue of monetization. Is monetizing in the video game industry better when we were younger, with all the content on the cartridge as it were, or have the piecemeal approach of taking parts of the game out to sell as additional content something good for the players? I think you might know my opinion on this one, dear viewers. Lastly, I will have a talk about perhaps the most subjective aspect of this notion. Were video games just better when we were kids, purely because that is when we grew up? That was when the world was still a little magical, as we were all a little ignorant of the world. We had some innocence, dear viewer. The internet will obviously take a role in this portion of the video. So, now we've laid out this situation, let us get down to the nitty gritty and take each point in turn. I'm an old dwarf, born in the 80s, growing up in the 90s. I used microcomputers like the C64 and the Amigas etc, along with experiencing the so-called console wars between Sega and Nintendo. I saw great 2D games and the rise of 3 dimensions with the likes of PlayStation, Voodoo cards, N64s and Saturns. I believe I grew up at quite a fabled time in the world of computing, the internet and those silly video games. The computational power of machines and consoles back in the day was obviously way less powerful than it is now. Such is the world according to Moore's law, the suggestion that computational power doubles every 18 months to 2 years. According to Steam System Survey, the average CPU clock speed of a Steam user's PC is 2.3 to 2.69 GHz. That is 2.3 to 2.69 billion cycles per second, processing billions of instructions. The average RAM or memory is 16 gigabytes or 16 billion bytes. The CPU of the C64 from when I was a kid was roughly 1 megahertz or 1 million hertz, with its namesake 64 kilobytes of RAM. We are talking of modern CPUs being many times more powerful. The same is true of consoles, with the CPU speed of the Super Nintendo being roughly 3.5 MHz or 3.5 million cycles, compared to the PlayStation 5, which has 3.5 GHz or 3.5 billion cycles. Lots of big numbers there and all that, which can seem a little too technical, and it is just the surface of the actual technical specifications of different machines. Don't worry dear viewers, that is about as technical as I get and there won't be anything more. Suffice to say though, the power of both conventional computers and gaming consoles is objectively greater by quite a huge amount. Developers do indeed have access to more resources than they did back in the day, but that far from guarantees the creation of a good game, I hear you say. Most certainly not, dear viewer. How about, are developers able to create games with a larger scope than before? Are systems more complicated? With the development of more powerful hardware, programmers and developers are capable of creating vast gaming worlds full of spectacular visuals in 3 dimensions as well as pixel art and other 2-dimensional settings. There is very little in terms of visual style nowadays that cannot be represented on the screen. Games like Cyberpunk 27 have massive sprawling cities full of people walking about the place and doing different things. Baldur's Gate 3 has beautiful visuals with wonderful looking effects and abilities, all wrapped up in an impressive looking world. At the other end, there are beautiful pixel and two-dimensional games being made all the time. You could argue that impressive-looking worlds have been created through the ages, with games like Elite or Daggerfall showing it was possible back in the day, but perhaps not as shiny. There are games out there with many great systems working together to create complicated infrastructures for many types of game. Advances in all the finery of graphics and computing has allowed developers to be almost completely free to create whatever they want. Though it must be said there are still limitations, just not as many as before. So yes, developers have so many options in terms of systems and graphical qualities for their games. But does that mean that all games made now are better than those in the past? This is obviously far from the case, dear viewers. There are some absolutely fabulous games from the past that are well formed within the limitations of their era. Perhaps sometimes when you have clearly defined limits on what you can do, how much memory is available, what colours you can use, etc., can inspire creativity in ways that you might not have otherwise. Certainly, there is more possibility within the realms of modern gaming. Games can have more to them and flex shinier systems, but that doesn't make them objectively better. Great games are made by people with passion and drive, by people with wonderful ideas who wish to make the best they can. This sentiment is very true and applies to both back in the day, as they say, and the modern times too. If you listen to developers whenever they give interviews or talk about their work, for the majority, they seem quite enthused about what they are doing and appear to want to make the best game that they can. With regards to learning from what came before it, I think there are several points of interest. It would appear that some developers out there, keenly inspired by other games from their past and present, have used their knowledge of these other titles and built on what had previously been created. Developers of isometric action role-playing games such as Path of Exile, Last Epoch and Grim Dawn clearly take inspiration from and build on top of the foundations of older games like Diablo 2. Crate Entertainment, the developer of Grim Dawn, literally built upon the solid foundation of Titan Quest, for example. Games of a great number appear to take notes of the good and bad things of older games and push forward with it. This isn't some linear progression though, and sadly there is definitely cases out there with developers seemingly unable to learn and then extend, instead essentially ripping off the features of someone else's work without adding anything of their own. Worse still, perhaps, are developers that seemingly haven't learned anything from their own creations, let alone other people's. Diablo 4, for example, at launch, at least seems to have learnt little from any of the previous titles. There are many seemingly well-intentioned developers out there, and they wish to make enjoyable games with meaning, but unfortunately they are apparently not the ones making the final decisions on how to proceed when creating a game. What seems to be becoming more common is we have studios perhaps trying their best to make a good game, but have become hamstrung by those leering above them in the corporate hierarchy wanting them to do something else. There were of course executives and that in charge of big studios back in the day, but they seem to be more hands-off, letting the developers come up with what they wanted to make. We have an even worse situation now, where many of those making decisions about a game are rather than some informed person who is likely a gamer themselves, it is literally just someone parachuted in from some other industry who works well in the corporate jungle. It is a terrible shame, but again, there is hope. There are smaller companies out there without the collar around their neck, preventing them from making the game they want to play. There are even some publishers out there that aren't completely awful. Again, I would be remiss to say this kind of thing didn't happen back in the day. Some studios were incredibly cynical, firing out lots of badly made tosh because they thought players would buy it. A good example of this would be Atari in the early 80s with games like E.T. As gaming has become more mainstream, it has revealed itself to be a very lucrative endeavour to those whose life is defined by how much money they have. This is sadly the reality of modern life. Lots more people have access to some brilliant video games, which is wonderful, but at the same time it has drawn nasties that wish only to engorge themselves upon the unwary. There is definitely still passion, but the bigger decisions can be made further up the ladder by people who have no interest in video games. To be a full-time creator of video games, you have to make some money from said games to put a roof over your head and everything else. As fluffy and wonderful as I would like to think of video games and their development, people need to be able to live, so sadly we can't just hand out everything for free. Back in the day, I'm sure you might be getting sick of me saying, dear viewer, you would go to a place where games were sold and look in awe at all the video games and machines you could purchase. The games existed physically in the real world. usually on a cartridge and later CDs, that you could purchase and place in a computer or console. Now, if you want to buy a game, you don't even need to leave the safety and comfort of your own home. There are numerous reasons why this is a good thing, from reducing the amount of waste materials to allowing introverts like me to not have to go outside where all the other people are. This also means that there's no limit to how many people can purchase a game. Whereas when we still had physical media, if the store had run out of copies, then you couldn't play the game until they got some more, or went somewhere else. It's weird. That era does feel like a long time ago now, but it's so fresh in the mind. There are many YouTube channels out there that talk about collecting physical versions of video games, so I won't bang on about it too much, but there is a whole thing to you having a real-life, tangible copy of a game on a shelf. That means a lot. There is a whole side that is probably lost now, of purchasing a cool box version of the game featuring unique art on the outside and the game itself on CD or disc or whatever, alongside additional items, from the game manuals to maps, little trinkets and all sorts. Besides the benefits of having a tangible piece of gaming history in your hand, which you can keep forever, with the modern world of downloading everything over the internet and the vanishment of physical media, if something goes wrong, like GOG or Steam going offline, you will not have access to any of the games you have purchased. Indeed, before the internet, when you bought a game, it had to work and have all of the functionality ready to go on disc or cartridge. You were mostly assured of having a full, complete product. Now we have day one patches and authenticating servers and all sorts of stuff. Game ownership has now moved to essentially leasing the game for a period of time rather than you actually properly owning anything. You can't trade them with a friend, and with many of them, if the service such as authentication is taken down, you'll never be able to play them again. I will just post here on screen or in the comments below about game ownership and saving games from becoming forgotten relics, no longer available here. This is a movement to try and get European law changed so that publishers must provide alternative means of playing a game once they turn off the support, i.e. patching out server requirements or authentication. It is a noble cause, dear viewer. We have been skirting around it, but let's go full on the subject of monetization. When I was younger, games were expensive, indeed roughly the same cost as they are now, but what you'd got was mostly a full game on the disc. And this is not just the required functionality to work, but all the content like bonus modes, alternative outfits, unlockable characters, etc. It was available to you should you wish to play it. Nowadays, there are lots of games out there, sadly, that will purposely hold back certain features to later on be added as downloadable content or sold piecemeal as small microtransactions. Now, as I've stated, dear viewers, developers and their publisher masters have to be able to cover the cost of game creation and have something to eat at the local inn before going home with a roof over their head. These are things that we cannot deny to someone. Games need to make money in order for the industry to exist. Sadly, we seemingly live in a world where that isn't enough. Dwarves can be tuned to gold, silver and other treasures, but we don't take the mickey and always provide fully featured products to any customer. The problem we have, dear viewers, is that rather than trying to earn back the cost and make some profit to make further games and grow the business, companies want to make as much money as humanly possible. Firms wish to send out great streaking, lean, groping hands that wish to avail you of every penny in your pockets and pound in your bank accounts. Sadly, in this old dwarf's eye, there's a lot of people that he can see with no interest in making wonderful games, but instead only care about lining their pockets with gold. As mentioned, the money men and all that, they only care about making more profit than last quarter. Nothing else matters. So if you can gouge out some more money, then so be it. Publicly owned companies especially seem to be beholden to this endeavour. And it's here we must talk about the dangerous ways in which companies act with regards to customer experience. Microtransactions in the way of lockboxes, packs, pots, pans or whatever else have come into the gaming sphere. These are small transactions involving the purchase of essentially some game of chance. This could be for rare items, in-game currency and maybe new characters or heroes. I personally find this kind of behaviour heinous and the antithesis of everything I hold dear about video gaming. Not only is this a horrible practice that can promote all sorts of unwelcome behaviour, it affects other features of the game. So much so that you're incentivized to participate in this terrible practice lest your own experience be a bad one. And further to this is the predatory intent of such things. There are people out in the world who can be affected by these sorts of practices, where they cannot stop themselves from spending more and more money on the game. Indeed, some companies very much wish for and hope for people to act in this way. What a terrible thing. The final notion I shall put forward is that of the simpler times when I was just a young dwarf. When I was but a beardling, there was wonder and magic to the world of which I didn't understand. I was spared the reality of real life and thought of simpler things with hope in my heart. I still had mental health issues, of course, even back then, but, dear viewer, I was still naive to the world, unaware of how things could turn out to be. Childhood for me was about riding bikes, watching turtles and playing video games, besides other things. Like mine, your world at this point, I hope, was only one of having fun experiences with the passion and hope of youth. There were no mortgages, bills or anything else to worry about. Just some schoolwork and whatever enjoyable thing you were looking forward to. When you're innocent and not completely assailed by your own self-deprecation, the universe seems more of one of hope. It is this time in life where video games can have a great effect upon you, and it did on me. Getting a console or computer of some kind was an awesome thing, of all these fabled titles you could play both alone and with friends. The amazing graphics and colours of the characters on screen, the epic music, dear viewer. I can't hear Wilderness from Golden Axe without it putting a smile on my face. One factor that might actually be pretty objective is the fact that when I was a kid at least, the internet didn't exist, and once it did, it was all very rudimentary. There were no smartphones, no social media, no online forums. The main source of information were in video game magazines. This mystified games further, because there was no great stores of knowledge and data online that would tell you how to overcome every section of the game, what was the best build, and where to find that one item you need for a quest. It was mostly unknown, besides what they might print in a mag, or what your friends might have to say on the matter. There were hotlines that charged a lot of money to tell you how to do things, but they were mostly never used when I was a kid. When you have to figure stuff out for yourself, with no outside help, this helps to keep it more magical and unknown, clandestine. Sadly, nowadays, there are guides for the latest games essentially from day one. Some impressive player has unlocked everything and killed all the bosses on stream before you've even embarked on your own journey with the game. There isn't anything intrinsically wrong with this, it just demystifies things somewhat. So, through all of my ramblings here so far, what are my conclusions about whether games were better when you and I were younger? Is it even a fair question? Well, I would say there's a lot of nuances here, a lot of factors at play. Computers and console systems are objectively more powerful, and what someone might suggest is better, but I don't think this always correlates to better games, just like that. It is indeed true that game developers nowadays can make games almost whatever they want, cost and number of developers providing, and there are some great examples of modern games out there, but perhaps more options doesn't mean a great game will always be made. Having limited computational resources can actually let bloom a great and ingenious creations to behold. The cost of video games back in the day were expensive, but for the most part they included everything you needed to play the game. Besides paid expansions for PC games, you never needed to download anything else, and importantly, you weren't endlessly scratched by the fierce kitty of corporate greed. I don't know about other activities and hobbies, but video games, being an expansive, creative and somewhat subject medium, means it isn't as simple as suggesting games are better now than they used to be. Super Mario World for the Super Nintendo, for instance, is still a great game with all the jumping and flying and finding hidden paths and such. Settlers 2 is a solid simulation village builder which is still very popular. Diablo 2 is played by many players even now. In fact, it is so beloved they did a whole remaster of it just recently. I will put the video I did about it somewhere on screen for you hereabouts. Many players enjoy playing the initial version of World of Warcraft nearly 20 years on. So I think creativity and enjoyment is very much mixed between the two, with some absolutely wonderful games coming to the fore all through my life as a gamer. I feel corporate greed is ruthless and unrelenting. It shouts, "Nay sir, we must have all the money. Who cares of the damage it does?" There are free games now, sure, and some are not horrifically monetized, but a lot are, and it isn't very nice. It is this that ties it in with passion and creativity. I'm sure most developers out there want to make the best game that they can, but are hampered by those higher up that may put greed before game quality. Again, there are some great games still made by quite large studios, so all is not totally lost. I'm enjoying Cyberpunk 2077 a lot right now, which is by a big studio. I am of course aware that that game has had its own troubles. The emergence of great titles created by What? I mean, the emergence of great titles created by indie studios seems to be a bit of a shining light through the sky currently. When not shackled by obsessions of rinsing players for all they're worth, some wonderful games can be coalesced into existence. So, to draw to a close all the mad, incoherent nonsense, I would say that there were good games back in the day, there are some good games now, and some good ones everywhere in between. The potential now is greater than it ever has been, with developers having access to resources like no other time in history, which can be quite exciting, but limited resources back in the day can encourage wonderful things. Creatively, there is lots of cool stuff going on and has been for many a year, but the shadow of evilry, that is greed, has sunk its bared fangs pretty deep into our wonderful hobby. The lack of the information stream of the internet and the wonder of being a child paired up to make some very powerful experiences that are difficult to catch in modern times. I think it is a shame that those after my generation didn't get to experience this, but perhaps they are making their own memories. We'll have to see. And there we go, dear viewers, an incoherent mess of a look at whether video games were better when we were kids. I hope it made some sense at least, dear viewer. Thank you for watching, listening this far into the video, and I hope you are well. I shall see you next time.